Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. So this session is actually about revolutionizing evidence generation by linking clinical trials data to real-world data, right? So tokenization is kind of the talk of the town in the healthcare data space today, with demand growing and demand and need growing for integration of different disparate data sources, right? So in this session, our panelists and moderator will touch upon tokenization of clinical trials data, which is one of the oldest data sources in the healthcare data space, with real world data, which is kind of one of the recent and the newer data sources that are available. So they'll talk about the mechanics of trial tokenization, some of the practical experiences they've had in running a trial tokenization study, and some learnings from that as well. So for this session, we have Dr. Aaron Kamauu here to moderate the session for us. We actually had Aaron and Matt on day one of the summit, episode of their podcast. So for those of you who missed it, we'll have the link on our website soon, and you can go and listen to that. But yes, so Aaron is back today here to moderate this panel for us. I'll do a quick introduction of Aaron, and then I'll hand it over. So Aaron is a physician entrepreneur and an industry leading advisor in the real world data space. He specifically focuses on leveraging real world healthcare data to support a variety of clinical research and drug development activities. This includes the use of with RWD to support evidence generation and submissions to regulatory agencies like the FDA. And he has this experience across the spectrum of pharmaceutical and biotech space and entrepreneurship and large CRO businesses. So with that, Aaron, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you, and thank you for everybody else for joining us and doing the session for us.
Great, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining. Great attendance. I can see the numbers, so really appreciate everyone here. And I will start off before I do introductions, just acknowledging that we do want this to be interactive, like most of the sessions this summit. So we're going to start off by a couple of presentations just to set the foundation for what is trial tokenization and how do we apply that and some lessons learned from some applications of it. Actually, I'm going to share my own screen. So I don't think we're going to share the PDF file on there. Yeah, great, thanks. So I'll go ahead and share my screen in a sec. So we'll set a foundation for that, talk through some practical lessons learned, and then, but certainly we want questions. So if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. We'll monitor the comments when we get to the second half of our session today. But again, thank you very much. We're really excited to have our couple of guests with us today as well. So first, Kathleen Gavin. She has a background in training in integrative physiology and bioenergetics and exercise science. And she serves as the scientific lead for clinical trials at Datavant. And she'll go ahead and give us kind of some of the mechanics around what is tokenization and how does it actually work when we're also maintaining patient privacy and confidentiality of the underlying data itself. And then similarly, great to have Tom Doherty with us today. I know you've got a background starting from a degree in business and marketing, and then having led through a number of roles around innovation, Tom, and most recently serving as data science and AI innovative partnerships at Novo Nordisk. So excited to have Tom here. And he's got some hands-on practical experience on the pharma side, implementing and designing studies that are doing trial tokenization. And so it'll be great to hear some of the challenges he ran into, some of the solutions that he worked on to kind of overcome it. And at the end of the day, we're hoping that the audience not only has an understanding of what trial tokenization is, but also an understanding of some of the key considerations that we should be thinking about as we look to leverage the benefits of these technology and these methods. So we'll go ahead and jump in, and let me make sure that that is sharing. Great. All right. So what is trial tokenization? Well, I'll start off real quick, just kind of laying the foundation of tokenization itself. And this is, again, a high-level overview. But if you think about a person's life, I can think of my own life. At this point in time, let's say we're doing a typical real-world evidence study. We typically would define an index date. We'd say we're looking for patients who have a diagnosis of heart failure or type 2 diabetes, or maybe they underwent a transplant, whatever the kind of event is of interest, or they started a therapy or intervention. And we would define that as the index date. And then any data on that cohort of patients before that, we would call that kind of the historical or baseline period, or any data on those patients after that index date, we typically refer to as the observation period. Maybe we're looking for certain outcomes of interest after a patient is on or not an intervention. And we want to see that intervention, was really effective at decreasing those outcomes, or maybe introduce some adverse events that we're looking at. But as we know in real world data, it's disparate. It doesn't always cover my whole life. Again, my medical history and my medical future, if you will, are represented in multiple data sources. Some of them are medical claims, some might be electronic health records. Different health systems maintain different health records. Maybe I go and receive care when I'm on vacation in another country, and there's a medical record over there. Some of them are good and continuous. Some of them have gaps in it. It's messy, right? And the other thing is we intentionally keep these real world data de-identified at the point in which it becomes available to researchers. So as we're now downstream in the life sciences and doing clinical research, when we procure or leverage some of these real world data, all of these real world data really, they're de-identified before we get our hands on it, before we start analyzing them. So if I got 2 or 3 of these data sources, it's really hard to know if I'm the same patient or which records are mine across those data sources. Or rather, the other way to think of it is, if I look at 2 or 3 data sources, how do I know which patients exist in all those data sources, and how do I merge those data records together with confidence? And so the idea there is tokenization. And again, Kathleen will explain how they actually generate tokens and actually do this linkage, what that actually means. But the idea being here is that we can generate tokens at the origin of the data, de-identify the data, but maintain the tokens, so that then when we get different data sources with these tokens, we can link the data by token, link real data together, for example, with some level of confidence that it is the same patient that exists in both of those data sources. And some examples might be linking medical claims data with electronic health records, clinical data, because we might want to have a combination of understanding of healthcare resource utilization and laboratory information, or medical imaging insights, or so forth. So now, what about clinical trials? So let's say I participate in a clinical trial. There are a number of visits, and the reality is if I participate in a clinical trial, it's a very small time period over the course of my life that's represented there. And so there's a number of reasons why we might want to also know my healthcare information before, during, and after that clinical trial, in a very similar way as the kind of baseline historical information, concurrent observation time period, and her post-trial information. We'll talk about some of the use cases on the next slide. But how do we link the data? We have real-world data that's de-identified. We're enrolling patients in a trial. We have consent from the patients to be in the trial. Even if the patients give us consent to link the data, how do we know where that patient's data is in real-world data when it's already de-identified? And again, the idea being, let's use tokens to do that. So let's use the same method to generate tokens on a patient when they enroll in the trial under consent. And then now, if those tokens also exist in the real world data, like we just talked about in the last slide, we now have a link where we can link the patient or the trial data to real world data. And I want to distinguish that for a moment real quick, is that not every use case is linking trial data to real world data. In some cases, we just want to know who are the patients in the trial, and we want to find their real world data for other use cases. And so either way, when we generate tokens at the time of enrollment, we can now link the patient and or their trial data with real world data for various use cases. And here are just some examples. Tom can talk a little bit about some of the use cases that are particularly interesting to him in his role at Novo Nordisk and some of his experience in the past. But some of the examples are understanding a patient's medical history from their real world data sources prior to their enrollment in the trial. And it can be everything from using it to optimize the protocol design, understanding the patient's medical history, look at their patient journey, et cetera. It could be surveillance or looking at data concurrent to the trial, even supplementing the trial data collection, optimizing a control arm or comparator arm around comparing it to an interventional arm, distinguishing patient subcohorts within the trial that maybe the trial we want to keep very kind of pure and stratified according to the trial design, but maybe we want to, substratifying the subcohorts using real world data. And then I would say some of the most common use cases I hear are post-trial. It's after the patient is done with their last visit, but under consent, being able to continue monitoring their safety outcomes, their effectiveness outcomes after the trial is completed without requiring the patient to have to come into visits, reducing the burden on sites and patients, but continuing the research beyond the end of the trial itself and evaluating even healthcare resource utilization. This last slide, in fact, I'm hoping through the session or the summit, we can just make these slides available because I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but just noting that we recognize there's a lot of benefit to the method of using trial tokenization, but there are also a lot of things we need to consider when we implement and design these kinds of studies. And so not to go through all of these right now, we'll probably touch on these in the Q&A and in the panel discussion, but just wanted to make sure we noted there's a number of things you need to consider. How do we get teams to work well together? How do we reduce burden on sites and on patients to implement this method? What are some of the nuances of identifying the right data source to link to for various use cases and so forth? And just noting a couple of presentations that we've done in the past on this. So let me turn the time over to Kathleen now. And Kathleen, as mentioned, can kind of tell us what is a token and how do we do that?
Sounds good. Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for that great introduction. And yeah, I just want to take a few minutes for everybody to level set on exactly what tokenization is. So it doesn't seem like it's just this magic of we don't know who, these people are, but somehow we can link their information together. And so I want to give a little bit of background. It can be pretty technical, so I'm going to keep it at a high level, but feel free to ask questions afterwards. So go ahead on to the next slide, Aaron. So let's start at the beginning. We know that the first step is removing PII or personally identifiable information is really important to linking this de-identified health data under various regulatory requirements. So as Aaron mentioned, once researchers are able to use this data, it's in a de-identified manner. And so that is really important to be able to share and utilize the data as needed, but also there are a lot of regulatory requirements that come along with it. And so we know that PII is the personally identifiable information that when used alone or in combination with relevant data, renders somebody identifiable. And so de-identified data has enough PII removed so that there's only a very low risk of re-identification. So we know that we can be confident to use it and not risk kind of emerging who that individual actually is. But that really leaves the question, if you remove all those identifiers, how do you link the data at the individual level? And so that's where the generation of a token, also sometimes referred to as a patient key, kind of comes into place. So tokenization is a process that replaces the PII with placeholders called tokens, creating de-identified data sets. And so you may also hear this referred to as privacy-preserving record linkage, and tokens could also be called privacy-preserving record locators. So often in the public sector and federal funding, we hear this PPRL terminology. So tokenization, PPRL, the same thing. So go ahead on to the next slide. Let's talk about kind of the characteristics of a token, what makes them really unique and secure. So tokens are unique, de-identified, and site-specific keys for an individual that can be used to match a patient's records at an individual level within and across data sets. So as Aaron had mentioned before, access to these de-identified data sets is out there. People have used them for a long time, but one of the limitations is that we haven't actually been able to link an individual's record over time at that singular level. And so what the tokenization does is create this unique ID across different disparate data sets that allows those data to become linkable at the individual level. And so tokens are trusted in healthcare. They're being used to generate research-grade linked data sets, bringing real-world data into clinical research workflows, which is really exciting, opening up a whole new area of opportunities that Aaron had kind of just talked a little bit about. So tokens or patient keys are encrypted codes that make the patient data linkable, but they're unique to the personally identifiable information. So the same PII entered into the same tokenization engine or software that's generating the tokens will generate the same token. So if you have your clinical trial data set and your real world data set, as long as the same tokenization software is being used to generate the token, that data will be linkable in the right process. And I'll kind of get to some of the other security details here now. So These tokens are also irreversible. So they have one-way cryptographic hashing that's applied when the tokenization process happens. And so this is critical for data linkage that doesn't compromise patient privacy. So what it means is the PII is used, but then it is stripped away, and you can't actually go back and reverse engineer what that originating PII is. And I'll kind of show a little example of that on a future slide. And then finally, at least at Datavant, our tokens also have site-specific encryption. So that isolates the information to that site. So if there's ever a breach, a bad actor can't access information from more than one site. So as I mentioned before, although the PII entered generates the same underlying token, the site-specific encryption ensures that token actually looks different between different sites. And that data is actually not linkable unless the software specifically permits the transformation of those tokens to that same encryption key. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but essentially, by generating those tokens, they're not automatically linkable. There does need to be extra security steps in order to make those tokens match and be able to be linked at the individual level. Okay, so let's do the next slide. So here is just kind of a little bit of a image of how the tokens are generated. So here you can see on the left is the input data to generate a token. So you have your PII, things like name, gender, date of birth, address, and they're entered into the tokenization engine. There's a number of different ways that the PII can enter the tokenization engine, but for simplicity here, we just have this schematic, and basically it undergoes a two-step process. The first is that hashing step that I described before. So that removes any of the identifiable information, and then it uses a unique encryption to make the token site specific. And so the non-identifying information that the sponsor wants passed through along with the token can be go ahead and be passed through, and you can see that here on the right-hand side, things like name, first name, last name, not included. But you can truncate things like zip code to be a 3-digit zip so that that information can be passed along, but it is not identifying. And then finally, just to kind of end on this part, I want to revisit the idea of the tokens being irreversible. So a great analogy that we hear used by one of our sponsors is really that we work with is tokenization is like a smoothie. So you're putting all the ingredients in, the bananas, strawberries, everything on the left-hand side, you're putting it into the blender and you're blending it up. The banana, the strawberries, they're all in there. It's still going to taste like the banana and strawberries, but you can't ever get those information back. So although the token is generated based on that information, it isn't like the last name is part of the character string that is the token. You can't actually kind of use any statistical analyses to get that last name back out of the token that is actually generated. So just want to kind of use that as a little example because I know it can be a little bit hard to kind of conceptualize that. Okay, next slide. So this step, I just want to talk a little bit more about how by generating a token, it doesn't make this information automatically linkable to other data sets that might have that same token. And so how this works, at least at Datavant, is that we have our end-to-end encryption that allows secure data sharing. So each company hosts their data in its own encryption format or site key. So this is adding an extra layer of protection. So you can see here that there's two data sources on either side of the screen. You have your clinical trial data on the left-hand side, your real-world data source on the right-hand side. Let's say, for example, it's a mortality data set. The tokens are initially created in the encryption keys specific to their sources. So each entity generates their tokens. Once both the trial sponsor and the real-world data provider enter into a licensing agreement where the clinical trial sponsor is going to license the mortality data from that partner, then the tokens can be transformed into the same encryption for linking. So at that point, wherever the sponsor chooses to do that linkage, the records can be matched by token at the individual level to generate then a data set that can be used to perform statistical analyses and generate insights. And so last slide here, just wanted to show one final overview of kind of what this all looks like all together. So you can see on the left-hand side, you have your trial information, the PII from the trial that's being used to generate trial tokens. So you generate a set of tokens on your trial cohort. On the right-hand side, you have a variety of different real-world data sources that have also been tokenized on the Datavant token. And so once you have your tokens on your trial cohort, you can use the Datavant Connect platform to assess the overlap representation of your trial cohort in your real world data types of interest. So say you're interested in looking at EHR and claims data. You can look to see, are my patients represented in data sets from certain data partners that are available on the Datavant token. That will inform the following conversations that you will have with those data partners to assess if their data asset is actually fit for purpose for your specific use case. Once you've decided on the data partners that you are most appropriate for linkage for your specific use case, then you would enter that agreement, and at that point is where we would do what we saw on the previous screen. We would align those encryption codes, allowing for that data to become linkable. And I just want to mention one final thing. Because all of these steps in this process, de-identified data is being used, it's necessary to have a privacy review completed to ensure that linking any of these two de-identified data sets, it could be simply, like Aaron mentioned before, just the list of tokens of patients from your trial or some of your trial data along with a real world data set, that linkage does not increase risk of re-identification of any of the data included in that data set. So that's represented in step 3 here, the comply step. So at Datavant, we have a team of expert statisticians who perform expert determinations to certify linked data sets as de-identified under HIPAA. So an expert statistical review is required to make sure that that data remains de-identified at that next step when it is actually linked and insights are generated. And we'll leave it at that.
Well, before we move on, we do have a question in the chat that's directly related to this slide. And so just to kind of take a moment to reinforce 2 things. One, that expert determination piece that Kathleen just talked about, to generalize that thought process for everyone, this is kind of real anytime you bring data together. So we often think in the real world data space that certain data have already been kind of organized and curated for us, but the people who organized and curated and collated that data also have to deal with this. So anytime we bring multiple data together, we always have to assess that final data set as whether or not it may accidentally allow for a patient to be identified. And there are a couple methods there, and expert determination being one of the most common ones, to ensure that even it's not only an issue for tokenization, is why I want to bring that up. It's just anytime we bring multiple data together and link it by a given patient, whether we know who the patient is or we're using tokens, the more we bring data together, the possibility to potentially identify a patient increases. And so I just wanted to drive that point home around expert determination was also one of the key considerations I had in my list. And then secondly, so we have a question in the chat around, given that tokens are irreducible and site-specific, Kathleen, and I know you kind of honed on this. I think this is steps 3 to 4. How is it possible to reliably link them if they're site-specific, I think is the question here.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to this. The first is kind of that there is site-specific encryption, but using the Datavant software, we're actually able to align that encryption to match. And so that goes back to the fact that the same basic tokenization engine generated those tokens. And so the software can be used to align the encryptions into the same key for that specific use case and linkage process. And so the important thing there is that all parties agree to that linkage so that there is no unauthorized linkage of one data set with another. And so that's why those site-specific encryptions are really important to make sure, linkage only occurs in the situation in which all parties are agreeing and it's, it's appropriate. The second part of that, especially when discrepancies such as last name change occur in one source. So this is important. We often talk about this as we generate a token, but really what's happening is the PII that's being entered is actually used to generate a number of different tokens. So you might have a token that is first name, last name, and date of birth. Then you have another one that is first name, last name, and zip code. Then you have another one that is like gender and date of birth and last name. And so there are a variety of different tokens that are actually generated for an individual. And so you're actually looking to match on multiple tokens to account for things like maybe somebody's last name is different in one token than another. And so in order to be able to continue to match over time, even though we know people's personally identifiable information changes. So maybe a token from an EHR, a recent EHR data set is different than a token from an older EHR data set. By generating those multiple tokens, you can actually help improve your ability to follow that person over time. And then a second step to that is, with the advancement of machine learning models and AI, at Datavant, we now have a match offering, which actually integrates in referential data, which means that we are using a large consumer data set that is actually tracking changes in PII over time. So things like changes in address or name can be used in a more probabilistic matching algorithm, so that what we can do is say, okay, over time, this person's token was this over time, and then this one element of their PII changed, but everything else stayed the same. And we can have a high confidence that we are actually matching on that same person, bringing in all of that additional information. So we do recognize those factors change over time. And so as technology advances, trying to advance our ability to utilize those algorithms to make sure that we can accurately and continuously follow people over time.
Awesome. So yeah, token equals tokens. There really is multiple behind the scenes, and sometimes it's easier to simplify to explain what we're dealing with. And to Kathleen's point, I'll just generalize a little bit, because you're hearing kind of how Datavant handles this. There are a few other companies in the market that also do patient privacy preserving data linkages. And at the end of the day, all of the methods, any of us who use these methods need to be conscious of that methodology underlying it and what level of confidence we have in that match. And that level of confidence does shift a little, even as Kathleen was talking about, even with my experience working with Datavant, depending on the level of the token matching also gives a slightly different level of confidence on that matching. And I know Datavant and other companies are doing all they can to increase that confidence, and that's just getting better over time. So as users of this, it's something to be aware of for sure. So Tom, let me turn it your direction, because I know you've got practical experience through your career in the last few years, and I know you're very actively even designing studies, and I know we even just talked yesterday about some of it. So you're designing studies in real time, even now, that are using trial tokenization as a methodology, a number of things that you want to kind of get out of it. Let me ask you to start with, what are some of the benefits that you see from the kind of pharmaceutical perspective? And then what are some of the kind of the lessons learned you've had in your recent past as well?
Yeah, thanks so much, Aaron, and thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it. So where I saw a lot of the value in trial tokenization is really kind of behind the scenes, when you evaluate all the time and effort that goes into a clinical trial within your organization, right? So starting from the protocol development all the way through to database lock, right? And all the people, resources, and time, the sites, the patients. Where I saw value is, why does all that data stop after the end of a trial? So when you first hear about trial tokenization, it's like, wow, we could really unlock a lot of key insights before, during, and after a trial. So that's where I immediately saw value, is just how much time and effort is put into a trial. And it's obviously the gold standard, but we can continue to evaluate patients over time, which is really exciting. From my perspective, doing this for the last several years, I do have some key learnings. I'm sure there's a lot more out there. But this is still fairly new, technology that's embedded into trials. So I'm sure a lot more will emerge soon. But first is setting up a core team where tokenization is going to touch across your organization. It's so essential to have that. And this team can be comprised of privacy, legal, clinical operations, data scientists, data management, statisticians, epidemiologists, whatever you see fit within your organization, but making sure you're not doing this in a silo, because you definitely want buy-in across your organization, and no surprises. This, as tokenization, like I mentioned, does touch a lot of these different teams. I think once that team is formed, it's important then to understand, why do you want to do this? So what is your goal overall for clinical trial tokenization? Because then that's going to help inform you of what you're going to write in the protocol development. So for example, if you're looking at overall survival in an oncology trial, you want to make sure you accurately and clearly define your intent in the protocol, that you're going to be linking to, let's say, mortality data set for 5 or 10 years, whatever you see fit. So I think that's really important, of like, what's your overarching goal of why you want to do this? And then I think under that overarching goal is developing smaller goals. So maybe things like How many sites are going to be actively interested in tokenization, and maybe set a bar of where you hope that the sites are going to gain interest. What's your overall goal for consent? Is it 60%, 70%, 90%? Definitely set some sort of goal within your organization. And then last, like, of the patients that consent, how much relevant data can we find within the real world data ecosystem? Obviously, this real world data ecosystem is growing, and Datavant has, let's say, over 400 partners. But one thing is matching to the patient, but the other thing is finding the relevant data of interest. Let's say if something hard to find, like BMI or cardiovascular outcomes, or some other things that are just difficult to find, you might have a smaller capture. So I think just setting your expectations internally is super important. I think also, like, based on my experience for consent, you want to make sure it's clear and concise. Something around a 6th grade reading level. This is kind of a newer terminology, so maybe not using tokenization in your consent form. Maybe it's something just about patient linking, or like Kathleen gave a couple other examples from her experience. And then you have to decide: is this going to be opt-in? Is it going to be opt-out? Or is it going to be just part of the main study, where it's more of like a mandatory initiative that they're part of the main study and also tokenization? We'll pause there. Yep.
Yeah, no, that's great. And thanks for setting some of that foundation. I'd like to dive in on a couple of the points you brought up, Tom. And, one of the questions asked about current technological and operational barriers to wider adoption. So I'll start with you, Tom, and then to you, Kathleen, because I know you both have a perspective on the industry around this. And I want to hone in specifically on operational things. I know personally, in my experience working with sponsors in this use case, oftentimes, and Tom, you talked about this, you're bringing multiple functions together. So let's say we go a few years back, prior to 2020, really, real-world data was almost exclusively used by like pharmacoepi and HEOR teams. Clinical trials did their way of doing things. A lot of SOPs had been developed and processes established, et cetera, on how both worlds function. And I've often thought of trial tokenization, and frankly also the external control arm use case, as being things that are almost forcing these worlds to collide together. And I feel like with trial tokenization, I often am trying to think, how do we reduce the barrier? How do we reduce the burden on clinical operations, sites, and patients as being one of like the big questions? And then how do we address things like privacy, which obviously come up a lot, and there are other questions in the chat about that. So Tom, from your experience within the pharma world, how do you navigate that, bringing those teams together and helping, again, try to minimize the burden and impact on clinops when they're so focused on, we got to hit enrollment rates. We can't put that at jeopardy. We can't put our typical trial things in jeopardy. And then Kathleen, after Tom, what is your experience as you see across sponsors dealing with that same issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's all about planning and execution. So if you're really an early adopter with trial tokenization, you've been doing this for a number of years, I think that the planning process could be a little bit shorter. You have kind of more of a well-oiled machine. But if you're an organization that's just starting to think about this, I would recommend, I'm sure both of you would recommend this as well, is plan this before, like 3 to 6 months before first subject, first visit. That allows the teams to have that foundational knowledge about what is tokenization first. And then, like I said, develop the protocol, the informed consent, site-facing material, patient-facing material. Get all your ducks in a row before the trial even starts. I think where it could be a little scary is if you try to embed this, let's say halfway through a trial, and then all of a sudden you're trying to educate clinical operations, privacy, legal, et cetera. What is tokenization? Well, then are you going to disrupt my trial? Is this going to slow things down? Because the last thing that any trial, they don't want to slow it down by a day. So I think it's really important of setting yourself up for success by doing this 3 to 6 months in advance is super important. I don't know, Kathleen, or if you have any additional insights to that.
Yeah, I think that is huge, definitely. And the second thing I was thinking about is smooth implementation as far as how you actually kind of integrate generating tokens into the trial workflow. And this kind of spans across both operational and technological barriers. So what we hear a lot across sponsors is, we don't want to have to add another technology for our sites to use. We don't want to, like Tom said, do anything that might slow down the process of running the trial. And so as you're planning this early, thinking about what are the technologies you are using to run your trials right now. And one of the things we're really trying to do is integrate the tokenization engine right into platforms that these teams are already using for their trials. So we talk to partners, sponsors about who are they using for their eClinical or EDC partner? Are they using eConsent? Is there a way that their personally identifiable information is already being collected as part of the study? And can we integrate that directly into those workflows to not add any extra steps? And if the data is remaining at the site, then we work out more bespoke kind of implementations to make sure that process can happen where the PII is living without having to kind of jeopardize any of the activities that are going on in the study. So is that planning early, getting all of that lined up and integrating as smoothly as possible in the processes that are already happening with the trial.
Yeah, and I would reinforce what you both said about that, and particularly call out informed consent. I know there's been a lot of work by Datavant, other companies, sponsors. Tom, I know you've been a part of this with multiple companies now, on how do you really align the documentation that's going to the site and to the patient to keep it as simple, as straightforward, making sure they're truly informed, but also sometimes even the terminology we use can like raise an unnecessary flag. And so just making sure it's crystal clear, here's what you're consenting to. I know some sponsors have even come up with ideas around maybe it's a 2-signature consent form, but at the end of the day, trying to make that process simple and also not put in jeopardy the willingness of a patient to enroll in the trial by incorporating this other thing in. I know a lot of ClinOps teams are really concerned, well, we're adding something new. Is that going to cause patients to not want to join the trial? And we don't want to have any barrier for patients joining the trial itself, making this as simple as straightforward as possible. And I think you're right, Tom. The only way that happens is starting early. Just talked to a sponsor about 2 weeks ago where they were not able to implement tokenization because they started the discussion too close to study start, and they just simply ran out of time. And then at the end of the day, the trial team was just not ready to make that move. And this particular head of epi felt, hey, if we had just started a little sooner, I think we might have gotten it over the line. So I think that reinforces exactly what you said. Along the same lines then, let's kind of talk on the technology side. So Tom, what kind of experiences, challenges have you run into technically implementing this? We're dealing with, Kathleen, you called it out already, we're dealing with various tools. Trials are already dealing with things like electronic data capture tools and clinical trial management systems. So what have you run into challenges implementing the token technically, and how do you overcome those?
I think I wouldn't really call it a challenge, but just maybe a longer duration of time is getting the sites to actually have the software and to enable them to create the token. Sometimes they have their own assessments from an IT perspective. That might take a week. It could take a month, right? So they all vary at different paces. So I think that was one of the key learnings. And now like companies like Datavant have a web-based version, which I think does alleviate that. Then there's also options of working with CROs that can help facilitate tokenization activities. So they could actually have like more of a plan of action with the life science partner where they're actively involved as a lighter touch on the pharmaceutical company. I think that's also a nice option, especially if you're first adopting trial tokenization. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I just think things are evolving over time. I think that companies like Datavant are creating some great site-facing and patient-facing material. They're creating videos to help educate. So I think things are only getting better and better. And I think that's where we're going to see like consent rates better, more sites that are actively involved. But this is still fairly new, but I think every year that we're seeing this, we're seeing greater success.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. And also, again, having been involved for a number of years, you're seeing that progress very, very personally, I think, and that's great to hear. So Kathleen, talking about it from the Datavant side, same kind of idea. You just highlighted the need to have that plan and integration decided earlier in the process. How about partnerships? I'm pretty sure, and I think you're already kind of engaging in many ways. Datavant has, I think, made the way in which you implement tokenization easier, as Tom just alluded to. But I think you also integrate with partnerships with service providers and other technology providers that probably, I'm kind of leading you a little bit, but I think that's there. Let me let you speak to things that you're also doing to kind of make that process more seamless.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the first conversations we have with the clinical operations team is talking to them about who do you use? Who are your partners for your study? Let's talk about how do you collect your information? How do you collect consent? Who's your CRO? Who's your EDC? Let's talk about what is maybe the easiest way for us to implement this. And so we have a number of different variety of options. From Medidata is a really popular one. So I know a lot of sponsors use Medidata, and within the Medidata Rave EDC, they actually have a separate module that's called Medidata Link, and it's actually for storage of PII for generation of tokens. So it's integrated with the Datavant tokenization engine, and studies that are using Medidata Rave for their EDC can opt in to using Link and then collect PII as part of that platform overall. We also have a really slick integration with Thread, the e-consent platform, where patients are actually generating their own tokens. They fill out an e-consent for tokenization, and as part of that process, they enter their PII and a token is generated. And so we have a number of different partnerships such as those, all the way from the full service CRO level through the eClinical, EDC, and eConsent partner. And one of the things we love to do is have conversations if sponsors are utilizing partners that we don't have yet. We love to make for them to make introductions to that team so we can talk to them and hopefully build out whatever integration or capability works best for the study team.
Awesome. So we've certainly been honing in for the last few minutes on how we make the upfront part of token generation seamless, technically, operationally easy for ClinOps teams, for sites, for patients. How about on the backside? And a question from Matthew Warner here around not just highlighting, I think, the hashtagging being inherently one-way function, but also on the backside, I think you're asking, Matthew, a little bit about ensuring secure and accurate patient data linkage when you're actually linking the data. So I know we've got a few more minutes as part of this session. Why don't we kind of round out a little bit on both of your perspectives, Tom and then Kathleen, on the data linkage side and things that you both are doing to try to kind of make that as seamless, as accurate, as effective as possible.
Yeah, I think just from my experience so far is one of the studies is more of like a validation study. And maybe I encourage that as well for organizations that are just getting started with tokenization. So having a trial data linked to, let's say, claims data and looking at like prior medication history or some sort of other measure where you have that source of truth from your trial data, but then you're lining that up with to, like, let's say, a claims data set. I think that helps justify it and give you more confidence that you've actually linked to the right patient because everything is lining up correctly. I think that was definitely a key learning for me early on, is doing a study that's set up like that instead of going to, like, let's say, regulatory submission route right from the start. I think more of like a validation exercise is super important. But then I know Kathleen could also touch on maybe the precision and recall of the different tokens and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Just very quickly, as I mentioned before, there is that deterministic token matching where the token matches exactly, but using kind of more of a machine learning probabilistic matching algorithm allows you to really dial in the precision and recall. So really the positive and negative predictive value of the ability to positively find the people, the correct people, and not have false positives and false negatives. And for research, you can really dial that precision to make sure you are identifying the real matches. You don't want to risk for really any false positives in research. And so you can really dial in that precision to the highest level to make sure that you are most confident in the matching. And so that's a conversation we have with each partner where their priorities are for precision and recall in their matching.
So thank you so much. I think we're at time here. I think the audience could probably tell we could go on and on about this topic. We're very interested in it. I had our email addresses up here because I think I can speak freely for Tom and Kathleen and welcome people to reach out if you have questions about the topic. We're all very interested in progressing it and learning all together as we go. So thank you. And thank you, RWEsearch Summit, for having us with the session.
I think I would just say thank you, Aaron, for getting this panel to our summit here. It was a really insightful session. And I think, Kathleen, thanks to you, the complex process, you just broke it down into simple, relatable terms for our audience. It was really helpful. And definitely, Tom, the way you explained the use cases and the growing role of clinical tokenization clinical trials definitely gives a better understanding. So thank you, all of you, for being here with us.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Looking forward to more discussions. Thank you.